Reporters. It's wonderful, and I suspect Joan asked me to give a provocative title. Actually, it was Dorit Rabbani who asked me to give a provocative title, and so I did. But I didn't realize it would be quite provocative enough to get both Chancellor Eisen and Mark Gary on the call to make sure that I'm really not too provocative. Um, I want to start, and I truly am grateful that all of you are here. I want to start by talking about a sabbatical I had. You probably all know that faculty members love to talk about sabbaticals. And not surprisingly, we get a sabbatical every 7 years. And my next one is coming up in 2021. So you can do the math. I'm going to talk about a sabbatical in 2007 when I was teaching on sabbatical as the master visiting professor. By the way, I should just point out that lovely title, being the master visiting professor, was courtesy of the fact that Richard and Susan Master were the people who had donated the funding for the professorship. So thanks to their last name, I got a very nice title. But I was the master visiting professor at the Pontifical University of the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. So for those of you that know a little bit about pontifical universities, the Gregorian, the Greg, is the Jesuit university. It is in fact the university that Pope Francis attended. And it is in some ways the jewel in the crown of the papal system because the Jesuits have the strongest intellectual tradition. Having taught in 2014 at a different papal university, I can tell you that what the Jesuits claim is true. They really are smarter than everybody else. And it was a real pleasure teaching them. At that university, they have a Jewish studies program. This is one of the great ironies of our history, or another proof that God has a sense of humor, in that the two papal universities that have Jewish studies are the Gregorian and another university, the Papal University of St. Thomas Aquinas, called the Angelicum, which is Dominican. And of course, the Dominicans and the Jesuits were the Catholic groups that most ferociously persecuted the Jews in the Middle Ages. So now in the 20th and 21st century, those two universities are post-Vatican II doing Teshuvah. And they both have openly embraced Jewish studies as part of their curriculum. And it's not just that they have priests teaching Jewish studies, which they do, but they also have American Jews and Israeli Jews coming to teach their students who are mostly priests and doctoral students. And it's quite wonderful that they have programs like this. The Gregorian also has an Islamic studies program, so they are the most progressive. When I was still at JTS before I traveled to Rome in 2007, I learned that the head of the Cardinal Bea Institute, which is the Jewish studies program, was a colleague of mine who had done his doctorate at Columbia University around the same time I was doing my doctorate at JTS, and we knew each other well. He's a priest. His name is Joseph Sievers. And Joe Sievers sent me an email welcoming me to the Gregorian, and he said, you know, Bert, because this is the Gregorian, we can do things for you that normal tourists just don't have the opportunity to do when they're in Rome. So please ask away. I know Joseph well, so I wrote him back and I reminded him, Joseph, are you sure you want to ask a New York Jew to be chutzpahdik? I mean, really? And he said, no, go for it, ask away. He said, tongue in cheek, he said, I'll give you 3 wishes. So I said, these are my 3 wishes. This is really what I want to do while I'm in Rome. Number 1, I want to meet the Pope. You know, may as well start big. Number 2, I want to go to the Vatican museums after hours when no one else is there. And as if that weren't enough, my number 3 wish was, I want to visit the Jewish catacombs in Rome. Not the Christian catacombs that are open to tourists, but in those days, the Jewish catacombs, which were absolutely closed and frankly dangerous to go to because they hadn't been properly excavated and buttressed the way the Christian catacombs were. The Christian catacombs are pilgrimage sites. And so because pilgrims go there, the church has invested a great deal of money in making sure they're well ventilated and safe. The Jewish catacombs, the city of Rome gave the Jewish community the opportunity to pay millions of euros to make them tourist friendly, but the Jewish community in Rome didn't have that kind of money, and the Vatican wasn't ready to pony up that kind of money for the Jewish community. And so the Jewish catacombs, by and large, have remained closed with very few exceptions. So those were my 3 wishes. Within 5 minutes, Father Sievers wrote back to me, and he wrote 3 words: done, done, done. So I was shocked. I said, really? He said, it's no problem. You do interfaith dialogue. I can get you into an audience. It'll be a public audience with the Pope, but you will be in the private section and you will have the opportunity to meet him. This was Pope Benedict at the time. And I must say, I was incredibly pleasantly surprised because Pope Benedict, who the press had led me to believe would be this very austere German, he was German, in fact, but was not austere at all. He was quite warm and welcoming, and even in the midst of St. Peter's Square, spent about 5 minutes chatting with me about what I was doing here, why I was teaching here, how unusual it is for a rabbi to come and spend their sabbatical in Rome. So that was my first thing. The second of my requests, I actually got to fulfill twice. As it turned out, in my class at the Gregorian, there was a Vatican tour guide. And she said that she would be happy to get me in after hours. So the first time I went with my in-laws. So it's always very nice when you can impress your in-laws. And they were duly impressed. But even more exciting than that, the second time I went with my daughter, who was an art history major at Vassar at the time. And for me to impress my daughter, well, that's virtually impossible. But I had the good sense to keep my mouth shut and just say, Leora, here is the map of the Vatican. You know, these are the artworks. What would you like to see? And she emailed me back from Vassar and she said, you know, Dad, there are a lot of interesting things there, but they're in rooms that are marked closed. So I didn't want to put myself too out there. I said, let me just see what I can do. And sure enough, when Leora and I went on the Vatican tour, they opened all the closed rooms for us. It was a great moment to have my daughter, A, see me meet the Pope, and B, then go to the Vatican Museum. I'm still living on that all these years later. But the most interesting thing, the most fascinating thing was for me to go to the Jewish catacombs. The Jews in the catacombs of Rome come from one of the great diaspora Jewish communities in late antiquity. The Jews who are buried in that catacomb, in those catacombs, there's more than one of them, were buried there between the 2nd and the 4th century. So from around the year 100, 150, all the way through, let's say, the 300s. And of course, it's a catacomb, which means A, there are dead bodies there, it's a cemetery, but B, there are inscriptions. And I was just fascinated to see the inscriptions. And even more exciting, there are frescoes on the wall. So I could see Jewish art, some of the earliest Jewish art we possess, there underground in the dark among the dirt. The day came and I was dropped off by the cab, and I find myself outside a chain link fence that has a big lock on it. There is a field full of weeds and nothing else. And I watched the cab pull away thinking, well, now what? Well, about a minute later, a guy on a Vespa, what else, pulls up, takes off his helmet, and says to me in Italian, I'm the electrician. I said, excuse me? He said, I come every couple of months to check the wiring to make sure that it hasn't shorted out because we don't want an underground fire. So they've arranged for me to take you through the catacombs, and they said that you would have an arrangement for me as he opens his hand. I had been warned about this, and I put a wad of euros into his hand, and off we went through this field of weeds. He unlocks a padlock. He unlocks a second padlock. He opens a door. We go down some stairs. He opens another door. Now we go downstairs in the dark. So he hands me one of those lantern that miners wear. He says, put this on your head. Okay, I put it on my head. I turn it on. I can see a little bit. He gives me another lantern to hold. And he says to me, don't get too far behind me. It's a catacomb. There are kilometers of paths down here. You could get lost forever. Like, okay, this was not welcome. But there I am in the dark, following the electrician or someone like him. And he says to me, if you want to feel secure, the best way you'll know you're on the right track is if you reach your hand up, and he takes his thickly gloved hand and puts it on the wire. And he says, this is the wire I'm inspecting for shorts. So if you hold on to it, you'll know you're in the right place. And I'm thinking, yeah, but I don't have a big thick glove on my hand. And if there's a short, I'm going to learn the hard way that I'm in the right place. This is not good. But I follow him. And as we go deeper into the dark, I see nothing. We get deeper and deeper and deeper, and then all of a sudden, there is a koch. A koch is a declivity in the wall that someone has dug into the tufa stone where they're going to put a corpse. I see it, but it's empty. Okay, fair enough. We go a little further, and I see another one. Oh, there's a bone. Then next, I see a skull. And then finally, I see a full skeleton, and on the wall, there is an inscription. There is an inscription in marble that says in Latin letters, meaning our alphabet, but it says it in Greek. Here lies so-and-so. He's got a biblical Hebrew name. Rest in peace. Okay, very nice. We keep going, and I get another inscription that says of the Jew lying there, he lived, he died. That's all there is. And I'm thinking, well, that's unusual. That's not exactly what we think of as Jewish theology. In Jewish theology, we think there's life after death. We think that there's reward, there's punishment. And yet he has this very different theology. We keep going and we get more inscriptions, and the most frequent inscription is an incision, a drawing of a menorah. They seem to be very big on menorahs down there. Like we might use the Magen David, they use the menorah. That is the standard symbol for Judaism in the ancient world. So dozens upon dozens upon dozens of menorahs. And all these names, most of them biblical Hebrew names, but many of them Latin or Greek names, but names that we know from the Jewish community in antiquity. And the inscriptions are just fascinating. I let the electrician get, I don't know, 20 yards ahead of me. I could clearly still see him, but I knew what I wanted to do, and I needed some distance. There are skeletons in almost all of the kochs, in all of these declivities, and because I just am who I am, what can I tell you? I wanted to touch one of the bones. I wanted to literally, like, as it were, commune with the dead. And you go to a Jewish cemetery, you don't usually touch the corpses. They're usually underground. And here was a skeleton. So I reached forth and touched it. I did not expect. Well, let me tell you what I did expect. I expected a bone. I expected it to be more or less petrified and dry. Instead, my finger went into the bone because it was spongy and moist. It was all I could do to not scream out loud. And because I knew I was going into the catacomb, I was wearing blue jeans. And there I am furiously wiping my finger off on my blue jeans, trying not to scream, and realizing that the moisture in the catacombs is not being vented out. So everything that's in the catacombs is full of moisture. And this disgusting moment of literally sticking my finger into a corpse, even now, if I think about it, I shudder. But I realize, look, I'm there actually to see what I can see, to have the experience I can have, and I'm especially interested in getting deeper in the catacomb to see the art of the first century. And by the way, the art of the catacombs is spectacular because it's frescoes and it's underground and it's not exposed to light. When you turn the corner and you walk into a vault that is full of art, It's as though it was painted yesterday. And you see the motifs, the birds, the matrons, just spectacular Jewish art. But more and more, I read inscriptions of the Jews who have not been visited, in some instances, for 1,800 years. And it began to sink into me that the privilege I had was an uncanny privilege. Unbidden, unconsciously, as I went from grave to grave, I heard myself before I knew what I was doing. And what did I hear myself? I was going, El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamramim, Hamitzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Hashchina. And I went from grave to grave and read the inscription and said an El Malei for these Jews who had not been visited for close to 2 millennia. As I said, it was very moist in the catacombs, and I thought that the moisture was getting the best of me when I felt it on my cheeks. Very quickly, I realized that that wasn't the moisture of the catacombs, that I was crying. And the electrician who came back to find me didn't know Hebrew. He wasn't a Jew. He was a Catholic Italian, but somehow he knew what I was doing, and he too was crying. And so to this day, I have had seared in my memory the moment of actual privilege, but the moment of being able to say an El Malei Rachamim for the Jews of Rome. When I got out of the catacomb, it haunted me. And the inscriptions I read haunted me because they were similar to, but not the same as, the Rabbinic Judaism that I've studied at JTS for close to 50 years. And I began to think, who are these Jews? Who were they? Were they like the Jews of the land of Israel? Were they like the Jews of the land in Babylonia that produced the Talmud? Were they like us, diaspora Jews who live in a much greater world and who therefore maybe have somewhat assimilated a bit and don't share the pieties of our ancestors? And the more I researched it, the more I came to realize that the Jews of Rome, that major community, where, by the way, the rabbis of the land of Israel would visit them. Can anybody on the call guess what they would visit them for? Fundraising. Some things never change. The rabbis of the land of Israel actually traveled to Rome on a fundraising trip. I know it's unheard of, but this is what they did. And we get lots of stories about the rabbis who do this and what they see in Rome. So I began to wonder, what is the relationship of Rabbinic Judaism to the Roman Empire? What is the relationship of Rabbinic Judaism, the rabbis of the Talmud and the Midrash, what I study on a daily basis? What is their relationship to diaspora Jews, to assimilated Jews, to the Jews of the catacombs? The more I studied, the more I came to realize that I knew the Jews of Rome very well. And I knew them very well because in the end, they weren't that different than the Jews of the land of Israel. They weren't that different than the Jews of Babylonia. And frankly, they weren't that different than the Jews of the East Coast who are populating my screen right now. They wanted a good life. They wanted to get along in a Gentile world, but they had a very, very firm and clear expression of Jewish identity. That Jewish identity included some, but not very much Hebrew. Almost the entirety of Hebrew inscriptions in the Roman catacombs, in the Roman Jewish catacombs, can be summed up in one word: shalom. That is the only word in Hebrew in the catacombs. Everything else is in Latin or Greek. So think about this for a moment. Think about yourselves in your own synagogues. If you shut your eyes and see what's on the wall and what's on the windows, so you might have some Hebrew words, the names of the Hebrew months, the names of the tribes, maybe even the parashah, but by and large, most of the inscriptions, if you will, in your synagogues will be inscriptions that are in English. In other words, you use the lingua franca much as they did. Our own expressions of how we live might very well be similar to those of the Jews of Rome. And the more I thought about it, the Jews of the land of Israel, which was, after all, a Roman province, the Jews of the land of Israel would have been quite comfortable with the Jews of Rome, much as the Jews of Eretz Israel today, for better or for worse, are pretty comfortable coming to America and hanging out with us, just as we're pretty comfortable going to Israel and hanging out with them. In Israel, in the major cities, we have information from the Babylonian and the Palestinian Talmuds. And one of the most astonishing reports there is that in the synagogue in the city, a major city in the Galilee of Tiberia, when they recited the Shema, I remind you, the Shema is a passage from the Bible. They recited the Shema in Greek. Why Greek? Because Greek was the language of the Eastern Empire, and frankly, it's what they spoke in the town of Tiberia. The Jews of Tiberia did not speak Hebrew. They were Greek speakers because that was what they spoke in those days. Hebrew was what people at the seminaries spoke, what people in the yeshivot, in the academies spoke. It's what rabbis spoke. In the inscriptions in hundreds of synagogues in the Galilee now, half of the inscriptions we have are in Greek. The other half, by the way, are mostly in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. But you get a little Hebrew too, verses of the Bible. In other words, their usage was very much like ours. They, as it were, assimilated, not fully, but identified using the vocabulary of their surroundings. The Talmuds, I mean, you can't ask for greater monuments of Jewish culture than the Talmuds. But the Talmuds have between 4,000 and 5,000 loan words from Greek, mostly Greek, and a little Latin. That's a lot of Greek transcribed into Hebrew letters. Some of these are actually words you know. Let me give you an example. If I say afikomen, you just had Passover, you may know that afikomen is actually a Greek phrase, apekomios. If I say another one from the Seder, when we dip in the beginning of the Seder, we dip fruits and vegetables. What's that called? Somebody can just shout out. You have to unmute somebody and give them the chance to shout out.
Karpas.
Karpas, thank you, Rabbi Steinhardt. Shkoyach. David Steinhardt knows that it's called karpas. And if we think about it, chaf, resh, pei, samach, 4 letters, too many letters for it actually to be Hebrew roots. It's not Hebrew. Karpas is the Greek word which the equivalent in Hebrew would be pri. So we say borei pri ha'etz, borei pri ha'adama, and in Greek they would say karpos, and then they would qualify it. Is it a fruit or is it a vegetable? So we simply use the Greek term. I'll give you another one, which almost everybody thinks is Hebrew. When you get an aliyah, or when Rabbi Steinhardt preaches, you preach from the bima, right? You go up to the bima. Now, bama is a biblical Hebrew word, but bema is a Greek word, and it means the platform. So again and again and again, we have many, many examples of, and I'll give you probably another one that you all know well. The Jewish courts were called a Sanhedrin. So Sunedrion, oh, there's another one, since I'm starting with SYN. How about synagogue? All of those are Greek loanwords, which give us a feeling for the extent to which the Jews were comfortable within the broader confines of the Roman world. They used, and Pirkei Avot is a very good example. Many of you have studied that tractate of the Mishnah called Pirkei Avot. It's full of wisdom and good advice, and virtually all of it can be found almost verbatim, paralleled in the literature of the Stoic philosophers. So the rabbis were good Stoics. They lived in the Roman Empire. They had Greek background. They knew Greek inscriptions. I could go on, but I subtitled this lecture Aphrodite and the Rabbis, which, not coincidentally, is the title of a book I published a couple of years ago that lays out a great deal of the relationship of rabbinic Judaism to the broader culture. So I want to stop here for a few moments, and we can take some questions, some comments. I'm just going to ask my rabbinic colleagues, no sermons, please, but anybody, Joan, you want to talk about how
Yeah,
they do their hand raising?
if anybody would raise the hand icon on the bottom part of the screen, and I will know to call on you.
Or you could raise your hand
Or
like
raise
this.
your hand. Don't see anybody. Oh, Rabbi Steinhardt?
Yeah, Steinhardt. Good.
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick. Since the Roman Jewish community predates the exile, the destruction and the exile, there obviously was a different relationship between the Roman Jewish community and the authorities of Rome before and after the destruction. Were there seminal events that took place in Rome at that time that affected the local community, and where was their treatment different after the destruction?
So let me answer briefly. Yes. There were events in sometime around the year 50. The Emperor Claudius apparently wanted to expel the Jews of Rome, and briefly did so, but then brought them back because he learned, much as so many post-Holocaust communities learned, that the Jews were essential to the well-being and culture of the city. Post-70, by the way, interestingly, there was very little reaction in Rome. Yes, they did have a triumphal procession. By the year 130, they had built that famous Arch of Titus, so that Romans knew that the Jews had rebelled, and Roman Jews had to suffer the fact that their brethren in the land of Israel had suffered deeply. But by and large, the Jews continued to be able to be part of the general fabric of the pagan Roman community. I think there was a chat question, maybe? Richard Plavin. Rabbi Plavin asks, does the Greek bema and Hebrew bama have a common origin? And the answer is no. Hebrew bama, bet mem he, does mean a high place. Interestingly, in the Bible, in the Tanakh, the bamot are usually forbidden because they're not the temple in Jerusalem. Bema is a Greek origin word, and it's just a linguistic coincidence that the two terms sound so similar. I think Lou has a question too. Is that?
Yes. In your introductory remarks, you mentioned that the Jesuits are doing teshuvah for their past practices of anti-Semitism. What form is the teshuvah taking?
Well, I would say a variety of forms, not the least of which is that the Jesuit university, the Jesuit Papal University, the Gregorian, which, by the way, gets the cream of the Jesuit priesthood from all over the world to come study there. Often priests come to the Papal universities for a year, sometime after their ordination, kind of like finishing school. So the fact that the Gregorian has Jewish studies and encourages them to sit with Jews and learn about Judaism is a big deal. But the other major form, which is enormous, you can't overemphasize it, is already now 50 years old. It's Vatican II. The documents of the Second Vatican Council, particularly that document called Nostra Aetate, in our time, basically says that the church, after 2,000 years, no longer holds the Jewish people responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. It was something that happened then historically, and the Jews today bear no guilt. Then they've gone further in the 50 years and basically have embraced Judaism as a brother-sister religion. And I have to say, and I say this as a New Yorker with a archbishop, Cardinal Archbishop Timothy Dolan, who I disagree with on almost everything. But Tim Dolan is a friend to the Jews. He has dialogued with Arnie Eisen at JTS, and I have to say that Cardinal Archbishop Dolan is very, very clear that we need to get beyond, this is his terminology, we need to get beyond a dialogue of grievance and instead work together, Jews and Christians, shoulder to shoulder, side by side, to address the ills of the world like poverty, hunger, homelessness, and now, of course, the virus. So the turnaround of almost 2,000 years of the church being our enemy to now, and I think I can say this comfortably, to the church being our friend is almost beyond reckoning. That is serious teshuvah.
Thank you.
Anybody else before we move on?
So let's move on and see if we can look at a Mishnah text. That's going to be, as funny as Joan was introducing me, she says, well, there'll be the introduction, then there'll be the bathhouse, and then there'll be the prostitute. It's like, oh my God, what am I doing here? But the bathhouse text is a text from the Mishnah, from the tractate Avodah Zarah, which is the tractate about idolatry. But it's important in that the Mishnah is the document upon which all rabbinic Judaism rests. Can we have just the first page maybe and get it in the vertical, the portrait? So the Mishnah dates from around the year 200, and it contains teachings, a compendium of rabbinic teachings that date back to the destruction of the temple. And in the Mishnah, in the third chapter of the tractate Avodah Zarah on idolatry, which is to say, of course, not how to do idolatry, but how to avoid idolatry, in that tractate, we get a narrative story, which is unusual. Usually the Mishnah is all about halakha. It's telling you what is the law, Rabbi X says, Rabbi Y says, Rabbi Z says. But here we get a narrative. And the narrative, we'll do it in English. It's my translation. Tells us about a certain Proculus, the son of Philosophus. Now, I just want to say, if that sounds like it's a made-up name to you, it's because it's a made-up name. Proculus just sounds very Greek, and Philosophus, I mean, really? I don't think that was ever a personal name. It means philosopher. You should know, by the way, that later on, it was a term that was used in the clergy community, particularly the Christian clergy. Monks would refer to one another as philosopher. So this made-up pagan guy, Proculus, the son of Philosophus, asked Rabban Gamliel. So Gamliel is the head of the Jewish community. His years are somewhere between, let's say, 90 and 120. So he's one of the original early core rabbis. He's very, very important because he becomes the patriarch of the Jewish community. He is really the leader of the rabbinic and Palestinian Jewish community. So Proculus asks our Rabbi Gamliel, who was bathing at the bathhouse of Aphrodite in the northern city of Akko. So many of you have visited Akko. It's often on the tour, but you don't get to see the bathhouse of Aphrodite because that's long gone. For those of you that don't quite get what it means, bathhouse, you wouldn't be far wrong if you thought Schwitz. Indeed, the Roman bathhouse was a great cultural institution. They had a swimming pool. They had a hot tub, literally a hot tub. They had a small tub, roughly equivalent to what a mikveh would be. You could go there and bathe. You could go there and swim. Most bathhouses had a library attached so that you could read. By the way, they changed the books to the wall so that you couldn't leave with them. No lending library, just a local library. You hung around in the bathhouse naked. And in the outside of the bathhouse area, there was a place you could play ball. Literally toss a ball around, probably a big ball. We don't physically have them, but we have descriptions of it. Including, by the way, in the tractate of the Tosefta to Shabbat, they talk about if you're within the confines of a bathhouse, can you play ball on Shabbat? I'm looking, as I say this, at David Steinhardt, who 50, 60 years ago, was the sports counselor at Camp Ramah. So it was 60 years ago, wasn't it, David? Or it seems like it. So here is the pagan and the rabbi, and this is their confrontation. And you have to appreciate the bathhouse is basically pagan turf, right? It's the gymnasium. We would call it the gymnasium. Why is it called gymnasium? From the Greek gymnos, the place that you are naked. So here's two naked people, one circumcised, one uncircumcised. And Proculus is going to bait Rabban Gamliel. He says, it's written in your Torah. Now he's going to quote from Deuteronomy. Let nothing that has been condemned stick to your hand. Now, it's almost beyond my ken that this guy Proculus is quoting from the Torah. I think this is the rabbis kind of putting the words into his mouth. In other words, what we're reading is fiction. It's not a real encounter. But it's answering a question that bothers the rabbis. He says, so if it says you're not supposed to have anything to do with things that are forbidden, what are you doing in the Aphrodite Schwitz? You know, go to the JCC. What are you doing in our Schwitz? It's the bathhouse of Aphrodite. Aphrodite, of course, is Venus, the goddess of love. Gamliel is not flustered in the least. He simply says, sorry, I can't answer you right now. I'm in the bathhouse and you're asking me a question of Torah. I can't talk Torah while I'm naked in the bathhouse. Why don't you wait till we get outside? That's a one-upment. So they get outside, and Gamliel patiently explains. He said, hey, I didn't come to her turf. She came to mine. It's not that they said, let's make a bathhouse as an adornment to the goddess Aphrodite. Quite the contrary. You can almost hear him say, I've been coming to this Schwitz for decades. I remember when there was no statue of Aphrodite. And then one day the building committee said, ooh, let's make a statue. So they made a statue. Now he brings it home. He says, okay, so you got this statue of Aphrodite. You think it's a goddess? Let me ask you a question. You pagans, when you daven, if someone said to you, I'll give you a great deal of wealth, would you go into your pagan temple naked? Would you go polluted? Would you go into your pagan temple and pee in front of the statue of the god? Because let's face it, this Aphrodite statue's here. You're stark naked. You're urinating at the urinals. Like, how could you think this is worship? The guy must actually have to concede the point, right? Well, we're not actually worshiping Aphrodite. Sometimes, quoting Freud, sometimes art is just art. And this then is what Gamliel says, and it's incredibly powerful and important. He says the prohibition, we're talking the 10 Commandments, mind you, the prohibition about images. Thou shalt not make images. You can't make images of gods that are venerated as gods. But if it's art, Gesundheit. Now, you can see, Jones put it up there, there's a picture above the text. Everybody see the picture? That picture is actually from the Jewish town of Sepphoris. We don't know whether the mosaic that you're looking at is from a Jewish house or a pagan house, but we do know that despite the fact that tour guides always refer to this as the Venus de Milo or as the Mona Lisa of the Galilee, we know who we're looking at. We're looking at a goddess. She has a fillet of bay leaves around her, and right at her shoulder, there is a little guy holding a bow and arrow. Does anybody know his name? If she's Venus, he's Cupid. So this is from a rabbinic town in the land of Israel, probably 3rd, 4th century, maybe a little bit after Rabban Gamliel. But it's very, very clear. Those of you who have been on the tour of the Galilee, you've seen dozens of synagogues that have all kind of images, including most startling, often in the center of a synagogue floor, there's a mosaic with a zodiac. And in the center of the zodiac, there is Zeus Helios driving the chariot of the sun across the sky. Everybody who has done work on the art and archaeology of Jews in the Galilee has said, what is Zeus Helios doing in Shul? Much like you could ask, what is Aphrodite doing in the bathhouse? And I think, in my humble opinion, the answer is that the Jews saw Zeus Helios not as a pagan god, but they saw it as God. God is driving the sun across the sky. That's what our psalms say. That's what we say when we daven, that God puts the sun in the heavens and drives it across the sky. And they were not sheepish about representing God on their synagogue floor in their art. They knew pagans did it. They knew Christians did it. They did it as well. For those of you who can think about the art in your synagogues, think about the stained glass windows, think about Chagall's art, think about what was Chaim Potak's book about that? He wrote a book about the artist, right? How did Jews represent in art? And from the time of Rabban Gamliel, the end of the 1st century, it became permissible to do artistic representation. I think not coincidentally, if we look at the archaeological record of synagogues that we've excavated in the land of Israel, and you probably know since 1948, we are celebrating, of course. Thank you. The book is My Name is Asher Lev. But since 1948, since the founding of the State of Israel, archaeologists have uncovered literally hundreds of synagogues. Some of them go all the way back to when the temple was still standing. And there's a break. Pre-70, the art of the synagogues is all geometric design. There are no human figures. Post-70, probably post the 90s, we start to see representative art of human figures. And we see that in a variety of synagogues. Most notably, we see it in paintings in Dura Europos from around the year 250. And I think it's connected to this ruling of Rabban Gamliel, that from Gamliel onward, it became okay to depict figurative art so long as it was not for the sake of worship. And from that moment onward, we have had a great history of art and representative art, not just in our bathhouses, but also in our synagogues, our places of worship, our places of study. And I know that Chancellor Eisen, I don't know if he's still on the call, is very proud of the fact that we have beautiful art adorning JTS. And I'm sure that when the new building is open and we can all come and see it, you can see that there will be great art there as well. So this is a good time to take a break before we turn to our prostitute, as it were. So questions, comments?
Anyone with questions?
I'm looking through all the faces, at least that I can see on this
for
screen.
the little hand.
Hi, Bonnie. I see Bonnie Epstein is on the call too. Anyone else want to ask a question? Any questions?
Don't.
All right, so I want to share with you a story. This narrative, it's literally a story about a prostitute and a rabbinical student. And it is found in the earliest rabbinic commentary we have on the book of Numbers. The earliest commentary on the book of Numbers, it's in Sifrei Bamidbar. Because it is a joke that obviously is going to appeal to the very rabbinical students who are studying it, this is one of the most frequently repeated stories in rabbinic literature. So it's the kind of story that I guess I'm obligated to say, stop me if you've heard this one before. But once upon a time, Rabbi Nathan says, well, Rabbi Nathan gives us a formulation. and I give Rabbi Natan a great deal of credit. He says every mitzvah has a reward. Now, you and I, we do mitzvot, and we don't necessarily think what's the reward. But he says, no, indeed, every mitzvah has a reward. And his example seems to come from the most innocuous of all mitzvot, tzitzit. So you put on your tallis, you got tzitzit. And do you think, like, what's the reward for tzitzit? Most of us don't think that way. We just put on the tzitzit because that's what you do. You go into shul, you put on your tefillin, you put on your tallis, whatever it is. But he says, once upon a time, there was a man who was very, very careful about the commandment of tzitzit, very punctilious about his tzitzit. However punctilious he was, however, he had a libido. And he heard that there was a prostitute in a harbor town. I actually learned this text from my teacher, Professor Lieberman, and he suggests that the harbor town was the town of Caesarea. Just by a quick show of hands, how many of you have visited Caesarea on the coast, right? And you know there's that big wave break. And there was a port there. And of course, if there's a port, there's sailors. And if there's sailors, there's prostitutes. So Lieberman is suggesting that we're supposed to imagine that this is taking place in Caesarea. But the other thing you have to understand is Caesarea was very much a rabbinic city. And many of the great rabbinic leaders lived and taught in Caesarea. And they had students. So he heard that there was a prostitute. And boy, this wasn't any hooker. She charged 400 gold pieces. And by the way, gold then was $1,800 an ounce, just so you know. 400 gold pieces is an enormous amount of money. This was a very, very, very expensive woman. And he made his appointment for her services. He sends her the money, he makes his appointment, and when the day comes, he's all excited, he shows up, and there he is sitting in her antechamber. He's waiting for her to say, next. Her maid comes and she says to the man, okay, you're here, great, I'll let her know. She goes in, she tells the prostitute, your, how would we say this? Your Yochanan has arrived, your John has arrived. The prostitute says, send him in. The guy goes in, and, you know, often rabbinic literature can be a form of rabbinic fantasy. Rabbis fantasize. Let me give you an example. There's a marvelous piece of rabbinic literature in which a voice comes from heaven and says, why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? The halakha is always the way he says it is. And for the rabbis on this call, you can all agree, you've all had that fantasy at one time or another. Wouldn't it be nice if some voice came from heaven and told your board, don't argue with your rabbi, he's always right. In this particular case, this is the rabbinic fantasy, and frankly, it's a sexual one. He comes in, he finds this prostitute, and there are 7 beds of silver. And then at the very top, there's a bed of gold. And he thinks maybe he's gone to heaven. Between each bed, there is a bench. This is a Latin word, subsellium. Some of you know the Latin word in its Hebrew form. We use the word for bench in Hebrew, safsal, right? Those of you who went to Camp Ramah, we used to move safsalim all the time. But when we were campers, we didn't know it was actually a Latin loanword, and the word is subsellium. So there's a bench between each of silver, and you can imagine climbing up, as it were, the ladder until you get to the gold bed on top. The guy strips off his clothes. Of course, he's wearing a talit katan close to his body. So the last thing he's about to take off are his tzitzit. And as he pulls them off, the tzitzit give him a smack in the face. He takes this as a sign from heaven that he's literally gotten a frusk from God. God has, kind of whapped some sense into him. So now he's like appalled. Oh my God. Here, and I'm sure he's thinking, well, there's 400 gold pieces lost. He's completely I translated it very delicately. It said he immediately disengaged. The Hebrew says something like he deflated. He goes down and he sits on the ground. And now this prostitute, she's never had this happen to her before in her life. So she climbs down and sits next to him. And she says to him in Hebrew, Gapa shel Romi. Again, Professor Lieberman was the one who understood gapa shalromi is actually a loan word. Gapa is agape. Agape. Agape is love. And here it's by the goddess of love. She's taking a vow in the name of her patron goddess, Aphrodite. Aphrodite, also known as Venus, also known as Agape Shalromi. She says, by the goddess of love of Rome, I'm not going to let you go unless you tell me what flaw you saw. She can't imagine. No man has ever refused her. This never happened. And he says, love it. He's such a yeshiva bacher. He says, ha'avodah, by the temple service. I've never seen a woman as beautiful in my life. But you know what? In the Torah, there's a simple commandment. And in that commandment, twice it says, Ani Adonai Elohechem, I am the Lord your God. That, of course, is the commandment of tzitzit. When we read in the Shema, in the third paragraph, about tzitzit, it says, Ani Adonai Elohechem, and then the second time we read it, we say, Adonai Elohechem emet, right? It's there. Why does it say it twice? The first time is to teach us that God will give us reward, says that Yeshiva Bacher. But the second time is to teach us that God will punish us. She now, and you can tell she's already changing, instead of taking her second vow by Aphrodite, she says herself now, by the temple service. She's ready to become Jewish, like she's so impressed. I'm not going to let you leave until you write down your name, your city, and the name of the Rabbinic Academy where you learn Torah. Now, it's at this moment that my rabbinical students first have some suspicion that this story is fictional. Up till now, they can believe everything, but they cannot believe that he would write down his name and write JTS, Arnie Eisen, right, or Danny Nevins. Like, this would never happen. Nobody could be that stupid, right? That's where they like, excuse me, did this really happen? I was like, no, it's fiction. So he writes down, I mean, it's just quite fabulous. He writes it all down. So he writes down, you know, my name is Joe Schmo. I live in New York. I go to JTS. And then he gets the hell out of there. He goes home. To say the least, he probably does not mention to his colleagues what happened to him that day. It's pretty embarrassing. Like, they're all wondering, so did you get your 400 gold pieces worth? He's like, well, it was interesting. You know, what's he going to say? And then she now is so moved by this moment that she decides she's going to quit being a prostitute and she's going to become a rabbinical student at JTS. Like I said, it's a rabbinic fantasy. So she takes a third of her wealth and gives it to the government, which is to say, she pays a bribe to whoever was protecting her to let her out. These guys are, in essence, her pimps. They're keeping her, as it were, enslaved in the prostitution business because they're making good money off of her. So she pays them off. The next thing she does is very unusual in pagan culture. She gives money to the poor. In pagan culture, the poor were left to starve. There was no charity apparatus in the pagan world. And then the third thing she does is she brings the last third of her wealth and she goes to the Beit Midrasho, we call JTS a Beit Midrash. She goes to the seminary of Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia lives around between the year 200 and 250. He is a disciple of the editor of the Mishnah, of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Rabbi Chia is one of the best known rabbis in the late second, early third century. And he had a disciple circle of very, very important rabbis who are quoted regularly in rabbinic literature throughout the Talmud. Rabbi Chia is, one of the big guys. He's very, very well known. So she comes to Rabbi Chia, and Rabbi Chia, we'll see, is well known because he's not stupid. She says, Rabbi Chia, I see you have a building project here. I'd like to make an endowment and name the new building. And he says to her, oh, maybe you met one of my students. He's not stupid. He thinks like, well, maybe she has a vested interest here. And then she gives him the note where the kids basically signed his own warrant. And he looks down and he reads it and he sees, oh my God, it's one of my students. And my student somehow knows this prostitute who's trying to do tshuva. So he calls the student in. I want you to just try and imagine how the student must have felt when he gets a summons from the dean and he walks into the dean's office and there's the hooker. How appalled, how terrified he must be. But Rabbi Chia says, take what you contracted for. What you first contracted for her, it was forbidden. But now she's converting, so it can be permitted. I will fill in, right, that he taught her, she converted to Judaism, and they lived happily ever after. And now the text itself can't resist a punchline. This is a rabbinic joke with a punchline that Rabbi Natan says, if this is the reward for the commandment of tzitzit in this world, in the world to come, I can't even imagine. So it's quite, I mean, it's so ridiculous and it's so risque and it's so off the wall. But I also want to say that I think push come to shove, it's also profound because this isn't just a rabbinic fantasy about a rabbinical student and a prostitute. This is a rabbinic negotiation. Pagan culture, Roman culture, Greek culture is beautiful to them. It's sexy. They want to literally get in bed with them. But they also have their Yiddish neshama. And they're worried somehow, as it were, that their tzitzit will rise up and slap them. How do you maintain your Jewish identity and yet at the same time have a marriage of Yiddishkeit with Gentile culture? How do you do it? How do you live in two worlds? How do you wed these two things together? And in the rabbinic version of this fantasy, in an expression of self-confidence that's nothing short of astonishing, the rabbis say, not to worry. It'll be okay. They'll come to us. They'll convert. They'll learn to do tzedakah. They'll learn to endow the Beit Midrash. They will learn to do Torah and to do mitzvot and to literally have it in their head that they want to marry our rabbinical students. It's just a fabulous notion that we can wed paganism, Roman culture, Greek culture, with what was biblical Judaism, and now post 70, after the destruction of the temple, is more and more a Judaism that's comfortably acculturated to that broader Roman culture. And that acculturation, the fact that the rabbis know that they're already halfway there, makes them confident that the pagans can come the other half, and that we can live within this broader culture much as we do today, much as we teach today in conservative Judaism and at JTS, that is a wedding that is, if you will, the reward for doing the commandments in this world and in the world to come, we can't even begin to imagine. So on that, let's take the third round of questions, comments, sermonettes. Now I'll permit a sermonette.
Let's see applause. Any comments?
Rabbi Steinhardt?
Yeah.
I'll do just a very quick little sermonette, because as you were telling this last story, I was thinking about the series that's getting so much attention, Unorthodox. Have you seen it, Bert?
Me being me, David, I don't own a television, but I read the book.
Okay.
I literally read the book this past Shabbos.
Okay, so the book, the series, and I hope many of you have seen it, the series is not completely true to the book, but there's this wonderful line in the series where when the husband of the woman who left Satmar and went to Berlin goes looking for her, together with this, Satmar thug, and he takes her to a bar or a brothel. He takes him to a bar or a brothel, and he gives him the following line. It's the second time he uses it actually in the story, and that is, the line is, there's a Torah at home, and then there's a different Torah when we're away. And I think that this Gemara, just like our movement actually, would say there's a Torah at home and away, but that Torah both at home and away involves the willingness to intersect with the larger culture or the other culture.
Yes, I want to say amen. I think you're right, that for them, those are very, very different things, and they don't mix well. And for us, the greatness of our Jewish identity is that there's one Torah, and it's the same Torah here, at home and away. We have one Torah, and and we have one Torah, which is the written and the oral Torah, but we have a Judaism that makes us comfortable wherever we are. I want to say, for me, the most wonderful thing I learned reading that book was that the Satmar Hasidim, who are really not people who play nicely, particularly with conservative Jews, that the term Satmar comes from Satu Mare. Those are the St. Mary's Hasidim. I just love that.
Any other questions, comments?
Any Satmar on the call? Can I also say, this is a point of historic fact. 3-4 years ago, one of our rabbinical students, a woman, who came to us from being literally a rock and roll critic in Western Kentucky, and she went to Israel. She fell in love with Jewish texts. She came to JTS and she got ordained. But she has an appetite for all things Jewish, including an appetite for fleischiks. And her appetite for fleischiks brought her to meet the Satmar Jews. And she married a Satmar boy. He was on his way out. He was off the derech, as they say. And her parents loved this conservative Jewish rabbi because she brought their son back to Judaism. And we're still in very close touch. She still does a great deal of wonderful Jewish education. And I want to say, to the Satmar's credit, at a wonderful fleishik's wedding, that the father of the groom said, and I'm quoting him, "Today, I'm not going to look at the stockings you wear. I'm not going to look at the fur hat you're wearing, or if you're even wearing a shtreimel and kapota. I'm today going to look at your hearts." And we're all celebrating the love of our children. And that's the same story. Like halavai, not only with the Gentile community, but within the Jewish community. We can learn that we can intermarry, we can love, we can have a Jewish culture that allows us to be comfortable, whether it's with Satmar or whether it's with pagans or Christians or Muslims. That I think is, for me as a professor at the seminary, my goal is to make our students and our Jews comfortable in the broader world, bringing Judaism and being proud of it.
Last chance for questions or comments before we thank Professor Vysotsky. Anyone? Rabbi Steinhardt again? No? Okay.
No, he's
No, I was just waving goodbye. I've got
waving goodbye? Okay, well, Marlene, was that a wave or was... Okay. Bert, that was as stimulating as I anticipated it would be. And,
thank you.
And thank you.
And can I just say, for all of you on the call, I'm not quite sure where you all are. I know Steinhardt's down in Boca. People are all over the East Coast and maybe elsewhere. We do online classes, and Nebuch, this year, we've been doing them this semester, and we may be doing Zoom classes even into the fall semester. Come take a class. Come sit in on classes. We love to study Torah with you. So please join us.
Great. And now
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bert. And thank you all, too, for joining us again next week. Please join us for Professor David Kramer, who is going to be talking about Jewish creativity in the time of crisis. And because this has become such a popular series, we will be having additional lectures over the next few weeks. So
Great.
stay tuned for that. Again, thank you all,
Yeah.
and stay well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Okay, let me see if I can do this.